Ravenswood. Even the name sent shivers down your spine. It was a place whispered about, a place cloaked in shadow and secrets. The villagers spoke of the Lantern Man.
A solitary figure, forever roaming the mist-choked lanes with a flickering lantern held high.
The legend was old, passed down through generations. It spoke of Thomas Gray, the former graveyard caretaker. He vanished one stormy night, swallowed by the fog and darkness. They say he still wanders, searching for something lost in the deluge.
Some whispered that Thomas sought peace for the souls trapped within the graveyard's iron gates. Others claimed he was condemned to roam, forever bound to the lantern's eerie glow.
Whatever the truth, the legend of the Lantern Man was woven into the fabric of Ravenswood. His light meant only one thing: dread. Ravenswood was a town imprisoned by time. Its cobblestone streets were perpetually damp, slick with moss and secrets. The houses huddled close together, their windows like vacant eyes staring out at the world. The fog was a constant companion, rolling in from the sea to blanket the village in an ethereal shroud. It clung to everything, seeping into your bones and chilling you from the inside out. The heart of Ravenswood was its graveyard. Ancient and overgrown, it sprawled across the hilltop like a festering wound. Crooked headstones, etched with the names of forgotten souls, poked through the tangled undergrowth. It was a place where the veil between the living and the dead felt thin, where whispers seemed to emanate from the very earth itself. Claire and Jacob were outsiders. They had come to Ravenswood seeking a fresh start, lured by the charm of the old village and the promise of peace. They soon realized that peace was a rare commodity in Ravenswood. From the moment they arrived, a sense of unease settled over them.
"You shouldn't be here," they muttered, shaking their heads. "Not after dark."
Claire and Jacob dismissed it as superstition. They were practical people, grounded in logic and reason, but as the days turned into weeks, they couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. They began to notice things. Shadows moving at the edge of their vision, whispers carried on the wind.
And then there was the lantern.
It always began with the fog. The thick, heavy mist would descend upon the village, transforming the familiar into the unknown. It would roll in on silent feet, blanketing the village in an impenetrable white curtain. The fog was so dense that it muffled all sounds, creating an eerie silence. And then through the swirling mist, a single point of light would appear, the lantern. It was a beacon in the darkness, a mysterious guide.
Claire and Jacob watched from their window, their breath fogging the glass. They had seen the lantern before, but it never failed to captivate them. The lantern bobbed and swayed, moving with an eerie life of its own. It seemed almost sentient, as if it had a purpose. It seemed to beckon, drawing them in. The light was inviting, yet held an air of mystery that was impossible to ignore. "We should go back inside," Jacob said, a shiver running down his spine. The cold was biting, but something about the lantern made him uneasy.
But Claire couldn't take her eyes off the light. It was mesmerizing, almost hypnotic. It was as if it were calling to her, whispering her name. The whispers were faint, but they seemed to echo in her mind.
"Just a little closer," she whispered back, her voice barely audible above the howling wind. She felt an inexplicable pull towards the light.
They stepped out into the fog, the cold seeping through their jackets and chilling them to the bone. The air was thick with moisture, making it hard to breathe. The lantern moved steadily onward, leading them down a winding path and towards the looming shadow of the graveyard. It was as if the lantern knew the way, guiding them through the fog. The iron gates of the graveyard creaked open as if inviting them in. The fog was thick here, swirling around their ankles like restless spirits. The air grew heavy, laden with the scent of damp earth and decay.
"This is a mistake."
But Claire was beyond reason now. She was drawn to the lantern, compelled to follow it wherever it led. The lantern continued its journey, leading them deeper into the heart of the graveyard. Shadows danced around them, cast by the flickering light. They looked like figures, tall and gaunt, their arms outstretched as if in supplication. They rounded a bend in the path, and the lantern came to a halt. It hovered in front of a weathered headstone, its light illuminating the inscription, Thomas Gray. As they stared at the headstone, the wind picked up, swirling around them with a vengeance, as if nature itself was warning them to leave. The shadows grew more pronounced, twisting and contorting into grotesque shapes that seemed almost alive, dancing in the dim light, and then they heard the voices, soft at first, like a distant echo carried by the wind. Whispers at first, faint and indistinct, like the murmurs of a forgotten past trying to break through. But as the wind howled louder, the voices grew stronger, coalescing into a chorus of moans and cries, each one more desperate than the last. They seemed to be coming from the graves themselves, as if the dead were rising from their slumber, reaching out with skeletal hands. Claire and Jacob exchanged a look of pure terror. They were surrounded with no clear path to escape. The shadows pressed in on them, their forms becoming clearer, more defined, almost tangible. They were no longer just shadows, they were taking shape, becoming more real with each passing second. They were figures, pale and gaunt, their eyes burning with an eerie, otherworldly light that pierced through the darkness.
We need to leave, now.
He reached for Claire's hand, his grip tight and reassuring, trying to pull her away from the nightmare. But Claire couldn't move. She was frozen in place, paralyzed by fear, her eyes wide with terror as the figures closed in. The figures began to close in, their movements slow and deliberate, like predators stalking their prey. Their eyes bored into Claire and Jacob, filled with a hunger that chilled them to the bone.
Run!
Jacob screamed, finally breaking free of his paralysis. He pulled Claire with him and they turned and fled. They ran through the fog, their lungs burning, their hearts pounding in their chests. The figures gave chase, their cries echoing through the graveyard. Claire and Jacob could hear them getting closer, their cold, dead breath on their necks. They didn't dare look back, they just kept running, fueled by pure adrenaline and terror. They burst through the graveyard gates and onto the path, the fog swirling around them like a malevolent entity. They stumbled and fell, scrambling to their feet and pushing themselves to their limits. Finally, they reached the edge of the village. The fog began to thin, and they could make out the faint outline of their cottage in the distance. They didn't slow down until they were safely inside. The door bolted shut behind them. They collapsed on the floor, gasping for breath, their bodies trembling with exhaustion and fear. They had escaped, but they knew that they would never be the same. They had seen too much, heard too much. The shadows of Ravenswood had seeped into their souls, leaving an indelible mark. The next morning the sun rose bright and clear, burning away the last vestiges of the fog. But the events of the previous night hung over Claire and Jacob like a shroud. They couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that the eyes of the graveyard were upon them. They tried to put the experience behind them, to convince themselves that it had just been a nightmare. But Ravenswood had a way of holding on to its secrets, of reminding you that you were never truly safe. And then, one night, the fog rolled in again, and through the swirling mist they saw it, the lantern. It bobbed and swayed in the distance, its light a beacon in the darkness, a constant reminder of the horrors they had witnessed. Claire and Jacob never spoke of that night again. The silence between them was heavy, filled with unspoken fears and memories they wished to forget, but the fear lingered, a constant presence in their lives, like a shadow that never left their side. They couldn't escape the feeling that they were trapped in Ravenswood, a village that seemed to breathe with its own dark life. Bound to the village and its secrets just as surely as Thomas Gray was bound to his lantern. They felt the weight of history pressing down on them. They knew that they would never truly be free, that the chains of the past were too strong to break. The graveyard and its inhabitants would forever hold a piece of their souls. a peace they could never reclaim. They had looked into the abyss, into the very heart of darkness, and the abyss had looked back, leaving an indelible mark on their spirits. And in that exchange, something had changed within them, something profound and irreversible. They were no longer the same people who had arrived in Ravenswood all those weeks ago. The village had transformed them. The village had claimed them, body and soul, leaving them as mere shadows of their former selves. And as the fog rolled in each night, enveloping the village in its cold embrace, casting long, eerie shadows across their home, they felt the weight of unseen eyes upon them. They couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that the village itself was alive and aware of their every move, that the graveyard was calling them back, whispering their names in the dead of night, beckoning them to return.